Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. My name is Sam. In this video, I take you through the concept of identity and access management. We will walk you through authentication versus authorization. We talk about roles, we talk about users, we talk about groups, and then we move on to talk about policies and then permissions. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please subscribe, like our videos, and share for others to know. See you in the video. In this video, we're going to discuss identity and access management, which you usually call IAM or IAM. So when you talk of identity and access management, what does it mean? IAM is a service, okay, that offers secure access control mechanism for all of your AWS services or resources. It just provides a way to secure access control over all your AWS resources. So IAM offers secure access control mechanism for all of your AWS resources. So IAM just gives a control mechanism to secure access to your AWS resources. So then this leads us to the issue of authentication versus authorization. What then is authentication? What then becomes authorization? Now let's delve into. Now when you talk of authentication, what it means is that it lets you create and manage identities such as users, groups, and roles. This means that you can issue and enable authentication for resources, for people, for services, for apps within your AWS. Okay, so when you talk of authentication, it lets you create and manage identities such as users, groups, and roles. We'll discuss all of this into details. As we've mentioned, authentication helps us to create and manage identities such as these users, groups, and roles. Who is a user, what are groups, and what are roles? So let's define our users. Now when you talk of a user is a person who needs to interact with our AWS resources either through the AWS console or through the CLI, AWS CLI. Now in this case, this person should be provided with a credentials like the username and then password. Okay, so that becomes of who a user is. If a person needs access to your AWS resources or services or your AWS in your AWS account through the console or the CLI is some kind of a terminal, that person is a user. And as such, you will need some credentials like the username and the password. Now let's talk of groups. Okay, I forgot one. Now when you create a new user, by default, this user does not have permission to access any of the AWS resources. Okay, by default, new users do not have permission to access your AWS resource. Now these users, of course, this is not a root account. Okay, this person shouldn't be a root account. Now when we created our free AWS account, when you create a free AWS account, it gives you the root access. Now when this root user creates another user, by default there is no permission assigned to this particular new user, meaning that he can never do anything in the account unless you grant that user permissions. When we do a demo, we will see more of this one. The next one is the group. When you talk of group is just a collection, okay, a collection of users and permissions assigned to these users. Now let's say, for instance, you are getting so many requests to create users and give them specific permissions. Okay, it is advisable by grouping all these users into categories according to, let's say, their functions or their jobs or their department. When you create a group and then you assign permission to the group, any user that is put in this particular group automatically inherits the permission that has been assigned in the group, rather than having to create individual users and assign permission to them. That will be so much of a burden, so much time consuming. Okay, so the best way to go about this is to create groups, and then you put users into them, and you assign these permissions to the group. Automatically these users will also assume that permissions that has been assigned on the group. Okay, the next thing we'll talk about is roles. Now when you talk of roles are not assigned to users. Okay, roles are assigned to resources or programming APIs that needs to access any AWS resource. These APIs could be outside of AWS. Let's say if I have a website that accesses images or pictures from S3, I have uploaded the images or videos on AWS S3. Now this website needs access to these photos to display on the website, and as such, before it can be able to have access, it needs to be granted some kind of permissions. Okay, some kind of permissions so that it can be able to access these photos. So this permission that is assigned to this program or this website becomes a role, in that it is not assigned to a person, okay, or some kind of service. Okay, so when these usernames, these credentials are assigned to applications or other third parties which are not within AWS, it could be within AWS, but if it's outside AWS or it needs within AWS that needs permission to access other resources, then we call it a role. Okay, so these roles, they are temporary credentials. Okay, temporary access. It doesn't take long. It shouldn't be too long. It's just on a short basis, then it's done. Now these credentials, they are managed by what we call the AWS Session Token Service, which in effect is called STS. Because these credentials are not managed by humans, it is AWS which manages these credentials. So it periodically expires it and creates new credentials for the roles. So let's say this week, if the website wants to access this S3 videos or something, okay, in the videos in the S3 bucket, maybe it will come together with this particular credential. By next week, it would have rotated so that it doesn't have a permanent credential, such that it could be easy for hackers to target it. So this AWS Session Token Service continuously rotates the credentials such that anytime these changes for security purposes. Okay, so that is roles. Let's go to authorization. Now when you talk of authorization, what does it mean? Authorization is controlled by policies that grant what? Permissions. So we discussed the issue of policies and permissions. Now when you talk of policies, what does it mean? Policies is just a document with a set of rules having one or more statements. Okay, in fact, policies contain permissions. Okay, policy is a file or document that contain a set of rules, or let me say a set of what? Permissions. Now these policies are attached to groups, attached to users, groups, and what? Roles. The authentication resources. Okay, policies on its own is not effective when it has not been attached to users, groups, or roles. So you should take note of that. It becomes effective when it is attached to them. And these policies they contain the set of rules which is called permissions. Okay. Now, what then is permission? When you talk of permission, permission enables actions to be performed on AWS resource. Okay. So if I want you to read a particular file, if I want you to create something within AWS, if I want you to list such things, such on AWS account, in AWS account, I'll have to give you the permissions. Permission to create, permission to delete, permission to see, permission to list. All these permissions, when they are bundled together in a file, is called policy. Please take note of this. And permissions are actions that needs to be performed on an AWS resource. So if I create a user, like I'm saying, by default, new users are not allowed any permissions, which means that if you're a new user, AWS doesn't give you access to create, access to list, access to do anything. You are just limited until you have been granted some permissions. And what are these permissions? These permissions are the actions you can be able to perform on an AWS resource. And when these actions are bundled together in a statement or in a file, in a document, it is called policies. Okay, now let's get a typical example. Let's assume you are in a house, you are in a home. Okay, whilst you are in a home, you hear a knock on the door. You go outside, you open the door, then you ask the strange person or the visitor who he's looking for, what does he want, and all that. So you ask these questions just to authenticate the person that indeed it is this house or this person or it is you he's looking for, before you allow the person into your home or into your house. Okay, when the person comes, he has been authenticated. Once you open the door for him to come inside, he has been authenticated. Okay, when he comes, what access does he have in the home? You probably confine him to the living room sofa. You tell him to sit down, and then you yourself, you go into the freezer or fridge, you get him, let's say, a bottle of water and a bottle of drink. Then you come back to chat with the person. After some time, the person leaves. So once the person is seated, he doesn't have access to get into the fridge himself. He doesn't have access to go to the kitchen. He doesn't have access to go into the bedroom. That restriction confined him to the seat of the living sofa, the living hall sofa, is authorization, because we have given him only access to the sofa and nothing else. He doesn't have access to come into a bedroom, neither does he have access to go to the kitchen. Okay, so that is authentication and authorization. Now let's assume in the evening, let's say your spouse comes home, let's say by 6 o'clock. You hear something, he doesn't knock, waiting for someone. He has the key or he has the PIN code. He has the code to the door. He just punches it and then he comes inside. Now when he comes, he goes into the bedroom, changes over, goes into the bathroom, showers, come down or come into the living room, come get some food, go over to the microwave, heats it, sit at the dining table, enjoys his food, finishes, come back to the sofa, living room, watches, puts on the television, watches the news, everything. By the time it's late, he gets up to the bedroom and then he goes to sleep. Now, authentication is when he was coming in, he has the key to the door. He has the code to the door, so he could open and then come inside. Authorization is the access he has. Now he has access to the bathroom, he has access to the bedroom, he has access to the kitchen, he has access to the fridge, he has access to the microwave, he has access to the television. That is authorization. And in AWS terms, all of these are managed by the identity and access management. Now let's head over to our EC2 console for a demo. Please, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please subscribe. Do subscribe to the channel, like the videos, and share for others to know.